I was standing in the quiet kitchen, fingering the edge of my coffee cup, trying to steady my nerves. Today wasn't just any day. Today, the house I had nurtured for decades might no longer belong to me. The thought twisted in my chest, a mixture of disbelief and rising tension. I could almost hear the walls whispering reminders of every birthday celebrated, every sacrifice made, every corner I had painted with hope. Before I go further, I want to ask, have you ever felt the walls around you, the very place you called home, slip from your grasp because someone you trusted acted without thinking? I tightened my coat, knowing I had to attend the showing, and yet a tiny, uneasy voice in my head warned that nothing would go as expected. I wasn't ready for the betrayal waiting on the other side of that front door. The very person I had raised had listed my home without a word, and I was about to see it unfold with my own eyes. The moment I stepped out of the kitchen, the winter sunlight struck the hardwood floors in long, narrow strips, making the familiar house feel strange and almost hostile. Every creak in the floorboards reminded me that this was my home, yet it wasn't mine to command anymore. My son had listed it without telling me, and the thought kept looping in my mind, twisting quietly into anger and disbelief. I wondered how someone I had raised could act so carelessly, so arrogantly, without even a hint of consultation. The betrayal felt sharper because it was quiet, insidious, carried out in a way that made me the last to know. I paused at the doorway, taking a moment to study the living room. Every photo on the wall, every rug I had picked out myself, and even the worn armchair by the window, they were reminders of a life built with careful effort. And yet, in the eyes of a potential buyer, these were just features to be evaluated and priced. The thought made my stomach turn. I had loved this house not for its market value, but for the memories etched into every corner, for the sweat and patience that had gone into maintaining it. And now it was reduced to a commodity in someone else's transaction. The phone buzzed quietly in my pocket, and I almost didn't want to answer. It was my friend, the one I had confided in months before about my fears that my son sometimes acted without thinking. He had offered help, his tone firm yet encouraging. We had laughed about how he could probably navigate this for me without anyone suspecting. That call now felt like a lifeline, though a thin one, dangling over what felt like an abyss. I felt the familiar knot of uncertainty. Could we really outmaneuver someone who had the audacity to take what wasn't his in the first place? I lingered near the staircase, remembering the small arguments from last year, the ones that seemed insignificant at the time but now felt like early warnings. The house had always been a point of pride, a place I imagined would bring us closer as a family, not something that would tear us apart. I thought about the afternoon he had borrowed the tools from the garage without asking, or the way he dismissed my advice on finances, brushing me off as if I no longer mattered. Small acts, each seemingly trivial, but strung together they formed a pattern I should have noticed sooner. After a deep breath, I decided to move forward. There was no point in lingering in disbelief or anger alone. I needed to see the listing in person, hear the murmur of strangers wandering through rooms I had polished countless times, and gauge the situation with my own eyes. Every step toward the door felt like walking into a test I hadn't prepared for, a confrontation that wasn't overt but would reveal itself in quiet, pointed ways. I imagined potential buyers making casual remarks, unknowingly stepping into the drama I had no choice but to witness. The thought made my chest tighten, but it also sharpened my focus. I walked to the driveway, noting the crisp air that carried a faint scent of frost and decaying leaves. I remembered mornings when I had shoveled the walkway, when I had repaired the gate that creaked annoyingly in the wind. The familiarity of these chores had always grounded me, given me a sense of purpose and pride. Now, as I approached the edge of what was once unshakably mine, I felt the fragility of control in a way I hadn't anticipated. I realized that reclaiming it would take more than anger. It would require careful observation, timing, and a willingness to act with precision. The neighbor waved casually from across the street, oblivious to my storm of emotions. I returned a polite nod, but my mind was elsewhere, running through possibilities and contingencies. Could I attend the showing without alerting my son to my presence? How much did he understand about what he was doing? I kept reminding myself not to underestimate the situation. This was no ordinary disagreement. This was a clash of wills, with history, pride, and years of unspoken grievances all piled into a few silent steps down the driveway. By the time I reached the front walkway, I had begun to map the potential scenarios. My friend's assistance would be essential. If I wanted to regain the house, it wouldn't be through confrontation alone. I had to rely on planning, subtlety, and the quiet understanding of someone who knew both me and the intricacies of the situation. The thought brought a small measure of comfort. For the first time since discovering the listing, I felt that the scales might tip in my favor, that dignity and foresight could prevail over impulsiveness and entitlement. The door of the house loomed ahead, solid and familiar, yet tainted by the knowledge that its status had shifted without my input. I pressed my hand against the smooth wood, a grounding gesture, and listened to the muted sounds of activity inside. Strangers moving, voices I didn't recognize, the faint scent of cleaning products mingling with the lingering warmth of my furniture. All were markers that my sanctuary had become a stage for observation. I knew I had to enter carefully, with eyes open, heart guarded, and mind ready to act. A subtle, almost imperceptible thrill ran through me as I considered the unfolding possibilities. Here, in this quiet tension, was my chance to reclaim not only the house but also a measure of authority and respect that had been quietly eroded over the years. Each step forward was a step toward reclaiming agency, toward proving to myself that resilience could overcome betrayal. I straightened my posture and imagined the careful strategy we had devised, the friend acting as both shield and instrument, ensuring that the next hours could tip in my favor without igniting a needless confrontation. The air shifted as I reached for the doorknob, my grip firm, steady despite the tightness in my chest. The threshold between private and public, trust and deception, past and future, was about to be crossed. I paused for a moment, letting the weight of the house, of years of memories and sweat, settle on my shoulders. And then, with a measured push, I stepped inside, fully aware that the next series of moments would test not just my patience, but my resolve, cunning, and understanding of human nature. The interior smelled faintly of fresh paint and the lingering aroma of candles, a subtle attempt to make the house feel inviting to buyers. My presence, however, immediately turned the air tense in my mind. Each step across the polished floors reminded me of the countless evenings I had spent repairing furniture, rearranging the kitchen for better flow, or simply sitting in the living room, reflecting on the rhythm of my life here. I was both the observer and the invisible owner, a silent witness to strangers walking through the spaces that I had poured myself into over decades. I paused near the doorway to the main hall, pretending to examine a framed photograph, but in reality, I was scanning the faces of those exploring the house. A couple lingered by the fireplace, their conversation polite and detached, discussing the layout and natural lighting. To them, this was just another property, a potential investment or a dream home. To me, it was intimate, layered with the laughter of my children, the quiet moments of solitude, and the sweat of years that no one would ever fully understand. The dissonance between their casual appraisal and my profound connection made the sting of betrayal sharper. Memories surfaced unbidden, and I allowed myself to drift into them for a moment. I remembered the first time I had painted the walls myself, choosing the exact shades for each room after nights of careful deliberation. The house had been a labor of love, a sanctuary meant to hold our family together through life's inevitable chaos. And now it was being showcased to strangers without a word of warning. My son's decision to list it without my consent had transformed these walls from protective barriers into a stage for strangers' evaluation, leaving me with a bitter sense of exclusion. A subtle creak on the stairs drew my attention. Perhaps it was the realtor adjusting a rug, or perhaps someone was approaching. I could not tell, and the uncertainty added a sharp edge to my vigilance. I considered calling my friend immediately, but I restrained myself, realizing that moving too hastily might alert my son to my presence. Every gesture, every decision in these next minutes had to be calculated. My mind ran through contingencies. What if he noticed me before the offer stage? What if he tried to confront me directly? The questions raced, each one heavier than the last, but I reminded myself that patience and observation were my allies. I drifted toward the kitchen, trying to blend in with the group examining the modern countertops and refurbished cabinets. My gaze lingered on the details. The scratches on the table that had been smoothed out with careful sanding, the marks in the corner of the floorboards that told of years of hurried footsteps and childhood games. This was my life documented in wood and stone, and I could not help but feel the weight of what was at risk. If my son succeeded in selling it to someone who did not understand its significance, these memories would be reduced to objects on display, stripped of context and meaning. My phone vibrated softly in my pocket, and I took a quiet moment to read my friend's message. A simple confirmation that he was ready to act, a reminder that we had planned this carefully. The reassurance grounded me, giving me the strength to navigate the tense room with a composed exterior. I nodded subtly to myself, acknowledging that although I felt vulnerable and violated, I still held a measure of control. This was not a surrender. It was the prelude to reclaiming what had been taken without permission. As I moved toward the living room, I noticed a potential buyer running her hand over the armrest of the sofa, chatting with her companion about the quality of the fabric. The casual intimacy of their evaluation felt invasive, almost disrespectful, yet it underscored the necessity of my presence. I had to witness this, understand their impressions, and prepare for the moment when intervention would be necessary. I kept my voice low, interjecting only with neutral observations when asked questions, careful to maintain an appearance of casual interest. Every response was measured, a shield against the emotional turbulence building within me. Memories of past disagreements with my son returned unbidden. I recalled the subtle dismissals, the offhand remarks that belittled my opinions on home maintenance or financial prudence. Each memory, once easily ignored, now felt like a prelude to the larger act of betrayal I was facing today. The pattern was clear. Moments of disrespect, accumulated over years, culminating in this single, audacious decision to list the house without my knowledge. The realization sharpened my determination. I would not be sidelined. My history in this house, my investment in it as both a home and a legacy, demanded that I act decisively. I approached the staircase landing and peered down into the hallway below, calculating the optimal moment to position my friend discreetly. He would act as an intermediary, ensuring that the house could be reclaimed without confrontation or chaos. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, as the plan began to unfold in my mind. This was no longer simply about observing. It was about asserting agency, reclaiming both physical space and personal dignity in the face of someone who had attempted to disregard them entirely. My thoughts drifted briefly to my children. I tried to understand my son's perspective, youthful overconfidence, a desire to take initiative, or perhaps a deeper sense of entitlement I had failed to temper. The reflection did not soften my resolve. If anything, it clarified it. He had misjudged the situation, assuming that the home could be handled without consultation, that it was a commodity rather than a repository of memories and identity. I felt a quiet satisfaction at the thought that this assumption would soon meet reality. Returning my attention to the group of potential buyers, I observed the interplay of conversation and inspection, noting where opinions aligned or diverged. Each comment, each evaluation, provided insight that would be useful when the moment arrived to make a decisive move. I felt the tension heighten as the showing progressed, the anticipation building toward the point where subtle observation would give way to action. I reminded myself to remain calm, to let my presence be felt without revealing the depth of the personal stakes involved. The final visitor moved toward the front entrance, glancing at me briefly with a polite smile that I barely returned. Every face, every gesture in the room reinforced the reality. The house was no longer a private sanctuary in this moment. It was a site of negotiation, both literal and symbolic, and I needed to prepare for the pivotal action that would restore its status to what it truly represented. My friend's subtle signals from across the room reassured me that the timing was right, that patience had prepared the ground for a precise, controlled intervention. As the showing began to wind down, I felt a quiet, mounting excitement mingled with apprehension. I had moved from disbelief to measured anticipation, from passive observation to active preparation. The house, once threatened by thoughtless action, was now within reach of being reclaimed through careful planning and decisive intervention. My chest felt lighter with each step, the tension in my shoulders loosening slightly as the strategy crystallized. This was the turning point, the moment where intention and action would intersect, guided by foresight and the resolve to uphold dignity over passive acceptance. With the last potential buyer exiting, I positioned myself near the living room doorway, keeping my movements subtle, controlled, and deliberate. Every aspect of the house, its layout, its details, its history, was etched in my awareness. I knew that what came next would require both patience and courage, that reclaiming this space was not just about ownership but about asserting the respect and authority that had been quietly challenged. The stage was set, and the moment of confrontation and reclamation loomed just beyond the next few steps. The front door clicked softly as the last potential buyer stepped out, leaving the house in a peculiar quiet that felt both liberating and tense. I exhaled slowly, allowing my shoulders to loosen, yet the tension in my chest remained, a reminder that the true challenge was just beginning. Every inch of the house seemed to pulse with memory, each corner whispering of the life we had built here. The arguments patched over, the laughter echoed in empty hallways, and the small victories of daily life etched into the very walls. I walked through the living room, my hand brushing lightly over the arm of the sofa, tracing its familiar contours, a physical connection to the past that bolstered my resolve. I thought of my son again, trying to rationalize his audacity. Had he truly believed that I would be absent, unaware, passive in the face of such a monumental decision? The thought was almost comical in its audacity, yet beneath the humor lay a sharp pang of betrayal. I had raised him with patience, guidance, and sometimes stern discipline, but the trust one extended had been taken for granted. The listing of my home without so much as a conversation was not just a procedural oversight. It was a direct challenge to my authority, my dignity, and the recognition of the years I had invested in this family and property. My phone buzzed again, a silent signal from my friend that it was time to begin our intervention. I ducked into the small hallway leading to the study, a space rarely visited by outsiders, and allowed myself a moment of introspection. In that quiet, I recounted the painstaking renovations, the sleepless nights spent managing contractors, the thoughtful placement of every fixture and fitting, and the innumerable little choices that had shaped the house into a home. Each memory reinforced the truth that this was not simply about bricks and mortar. It was about the years of my life poured into a space that my son had attempted to commodify without consultation. The plan had always been delicate. Witness the showing without disrupting it, understand how outsiders perceived the space, and then quietly reclaim ownership before the transaction could finalize. The subtlety required a calm exterior and precise timing, both of which I had cultivated through years of managing difficult family dynamics. I positioned myself near the study door, fingers lightly resting on the frame, listening to the distant murmur of the realtor and the visitors in the main hall. It was a dance of patience and observation, and I had rehearsed it countless times in my mind over the previous weeks. Memories of my son's earlier dismissals surfaced again, more sharply now that I was on the threshold of action. He had always assumed I would follow the path he envisioned, that my consent would be implicit and unquestioning. I remembered the subtle remarks, the offhand challenges to my decisions, the casual disregard for my guidance on other matters of significance. None of these had prepared me for this moment, yet they had shaped the emotional armor I now wore. Each memory acted as a reminder that I needed to act with precision and confidence. Hesitation could mean losing more than just the house. It could mean ceding the narrative of my own life. I glanced at the front hall, noting the pattern of sunlight as it shifted across the polished floors. The shifting light cast long, uneven shadows that reminded me of the tension lingering in this house, the interplay of presence and absence, of influence and neglect. I thought about the legal aspects, the paperwork, the role of my friend as an intermediary, and the delicate choreography required to reclaim the property without escalating confrontation. Every element had to be aligned, every step deliberate. There was no room for impulsive emotion. This was a matter of strategy as much as of sentiment. Moving cautiously, I observed the house from several vantage points, checking how light, space, and perspective influenced the perception of each room. The couple who had been inspecting the kitchen moments before had left, leaving only an empty echo that magnified my sense of purpose. In the quiet, I imagined the potential outcome, mentally rehearsing the sequence of steps that would allow my friend to act on my behalf. Each imagined motion, each calculated decision, reinforced my sense of control in a situation where, moments ago, I had felt powerless. The betrayal of trust was still fresh, but now it was tempered by anticipation. I realized that witnessing the showing firsthand, although emotionally taxing, had given me an unexpected advantage. I understood how the property might be evaluated, the points of interest buyers might emphasize, and the subtle ways in which my son's listing had framed the narrative of the house. That knowledge, combined with my careful planning, positioned me to intervene effectively and reclaim both the space and the respect that had been momentarily compromised. A sudden creak from the staircase drew my attention, and I felt my pulse quicken. Was it my son returning unexpectedly, or merely the house settling under its own weight? The uncertainty sharpened my awareness. I reminded myself that control did not come from suppressing anxiety, but from channeling it into observation, timing, and calculated action. Every moment counted, and the delicate equilibrium of presence and invisibility would determine whether this effort succeeded or failed. I paused near the study doorway, thinking of the symbolic weight of the rooms themselves. The living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, each space represented not just physical utility but emotional labor, a chronicle of my family's history. The potential erasure of that labor through a hasty sale was intolerable. I imagined the interaction between my friend and the buyers, envisioning how their perceptions could be subtly influenced, and how the opportunity to reclaim the home could be realized without unnecessary confrontation. At that moment, I recalled the subtle lessons of patience my own parents had imparted. The value of timing, the importance of strategy over impulse, the quiet power of observation. All were relevant now as I stood in the quiet hallway. I felt a growing sense of empowerment. Although the act of betrayal had initially shaken me, it now served as a catalyst, sharpening my determination and clarifying the actions necessary to restore both property and dignity. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting warmer tones through the windows and highlighting the textures of the walls and floors. Each familiar surface seemed to affirm the necessity of my presence, the reality of my life's imprint upon this home. I reflected on the irony of the situation. The son's attempt to bypass me had inadvertently provided the perfect opportunity to assert both ownership and authority, to demonstrate that respect and consultation could not be so casually disregarded. As the last shadows settled across the main hallway, I signaled subtly to my friend, confirming that the moment for intervention had arrived. I felt a mixture of relief and adrenaline, the culmination of observation, planning, and reflection converging into the precise instant where action would be decisive. The home, so recently threatened by thoughtless action, would soon be reclaimed not only in legal terms but in the reaffirmation of personal dignity and family recognition. I took a final deep breath, sensing the shift from observation to agency. The quiet, tense house had become the stage for a carefully orchestrated reclamation, where each movement, each decision, carried weight beyond the immediate moment. The anticipation of confrontation, the careful choreography of my friend's involvement, and the potential transformation of the house from a site of betrayal to one of regained authority all coalesced in a singular focus. In that quiet, charged moment, I realized that the most significant battle was not merely about property, but about asserting the respect and recognition that had been momentarily denied. The evening light had softened, drifting through the windows in long golden slants that illuminated dust motes dancing lazily in the air. I lingered in the hallway, absorbing the stillness of the home, the familiar smells of polished wood and faint traces of old meals, and the quiet tension that lingered like a held breath. The house seemed to recognize me, acknowledging my presence as if it understood the intent behind my lingering. I knew that soon this quiet would give way to action, and the house would witness a subtle but decisive reclaiming of authority. The memory of my son listing the home without permission kept replaying, sharper each time I revisited it in my mind. I remembered the casual tone he used when mentioning the listing, almost expecting me to shrug and accept it, as if my years of care and investment could be dismissed so easily. That expectation was a betrayal not of a simple transaction, but of trust, of respect, of the family bond one had labored over for decades. I felt a pang of sadness intertwined with determination. Sadness for what had been fractured, and determination to correct what could still be set right. My friend arrived quietly, carrying the documents that would allow the process to move forward without confrontation. We shared a brief, knowing glance. No words were necessary. This was our choreography, practiced in imagination but now coming to life in the tangible space of my home. I guided them gently toward the study where the paperwork was staged, each step measured and deliberate. Even now, I maintained my calm exterior, masking the storm of emotions that roiled beneath the surface. This calmness was essential, not only for practical reasons but for the affirmation that I would not be undermined quietly. As I moved through the kitchen, memories of earlier meals, late-night conversations, and quiet mornings surfaced. The house, in a way, held the echoes of all those moments, and each memory strengthened my resolve. I recalled the times I had adjusted the furniture for better light, repaired a leaking tap, or painted a wall just so. None of that labor had been trivial, and yet my son's unilateral decision had attempted to erase the significance of it. The sense of erasure stung, but it also clarified my purpose, to restore not only the ownership but the acknowledgement of the effort that had shaped this house into a home. I paused briefly in the living room, listening to the faint sound of the street outside, the occasional car passing, the muffled voices of neighbors. I thought about the family gatherings we had held here, the laughter that once filled the space, and the way the house seemed to embrace its occupants. That warmth had been threatened by a single act of neglect, yet it remained resilient, as if waiting for someone to reclaim it. I felt the weight of responsibility settle firmly on my shoulders, a mix of pride and quiet resolve, and I knew that the upcoming actions would determine not just the house's future, but the tone of the family's dynamics for months to come. In the study, the documents lay neatly arranged, each one a necessary step in regaining control. I ran my fingers over the edges, feeling the weight of paper and ink, and considered the legal implications of each signature. While the process could have been straightforward if approached correctly, the emotional undercurrent added complexity. It was no longer just a matter of property. It had become a test of authority, trust, and the recognition of years of personal investment. I felt a sense of both anxiety and empowerment, the anxiety of navigating delicate family tensions, and the empowerment of knowing I had prepared thoroughly. The thought of facing my son directly entered my mind, and I shivered slightly at the tension it would bring. Confrontation had always been challenging, yet avoidance was no longer an option. I envisioned the scene, the dialogue carefully measured, the words precise to convey authority without unnecessary anger. My plan relied on subtlety, strategy, and observation, the very qualities that had guided me through previous family disputes. Acting impulsively could undo everything, yet hesitation could allow him to undermine the process again. The balance was delicate, and I felt the familiar mix of nerves and determination that always accompanied high-stakes moments. I reflected on the patterns that had led to this moment, tracing the small choices and moments of neglect that had allowed this tension to build. My son's impatience, my occasional leniency, and the quiet assumption of his role in family decisions had all contributed to the environment where this listing occurred. Acknowledging my own role did not diminish his responsibility, but it provided clarity on how to approach the next steps. Awareness of the dynamics gave me insight into his motivations, which would be essential in steering the interaction toward a constructive outcome. A sudden sound from upstairs, the soft creak of a floorboard, made me freeze. My heart skipped, a reminder that unpredictability remained. I allowed myself a deep breath, focusing on observation rather than reaction. In this moment, patience was an instrument of control, and my friend's presence provided a buffer against impulsive decisions. The stage was set. All that remained was to execute with measured precision, guided by careful reflection and the awareness of the house's emotional significance. I walked slowly back into the living room, glancing at the windows where the sun had now set, leaving long shadows and dim light. The familiar objects, the worn armchairs, and the framed photographs of family events all seemed to stand witness to the unfolding drama. I drew strength from their silent affirmation, understanding that reclaiming the home meant restoring a narrative that had been disrupted, reaffirming that my years of care and dedication could not be ignored or erased. The plan to use my friend as the intermediary required meticulous timing. I considered potential objections from the buyers, the reactions of my son, and the small ways in which miscommunication could complicate the process. Each variable demanded attention, yet the familiarity of the house and the clarity of purpose offered a grounding stability. I felt the tension coiling like a spring, ready to release when the moment of decisive action arrived. I allowed myself a brief smile, acknowledging that the challenge was both daunting and invigorating. The house, with its silent history, had become a battlefield of sorts, yet one where strategy, reflection, and composure could prevail. The emotional stakes were high, but so were the rewards. Restoration of authority, recognition of effort, and the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming what had been temporarily endangered. As twilight settled fully, I positioned myself near the study, signaling subtly to my friend that the moment to move had arrived. Every step, every gesture carried weight. The emotional complexity of the evening, the mix of betrayal, reflection, and empowerment, coalesced into a singular focus. Reclaim the house with dignity intact, ensuring that the home, the memories, and the labor invested in it were recognized and preserved. The anticipation was palpable, yet tempered by preparation and patience. The interplay of shadow and light, the silent presence of the home itself, and the carefully orchestrated sequence of actions all combined to create a moment of profound significance. I understood that this was more than property. It was the assertion of personal history, familial respect, and the enduring value of careful stewardship. The night would either confirm my resolve or challenge it in unforeseen ways, but I was ready to face the outcome with measured determination. The day of the showing arrived with a quiet tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting long lines across the floorboards, and I walked each room slowly, noticing details I had never appreciated before. The way the rug lay slightly uneven, the faint scratch on the kitchen counter, the slight tilt of a picture frame. Each observation grounded me, reminded me that this was my home, a space shaped by years of effort and care. My heart beat steadily, but beneath the surface, anticipation mingled with a subtle anxiety. The stage was set, and soon the confrontation would take form. My friend arrived early, carrying the signed agreements and the documents necessary for the repurchase. We exchanged a quick, meaningful glance, each understanding the significance of this moment without speaking. The act itself was deceptively simple: buy back the house. But the emotional weight made it feel like navigating a minefield. I walked alongside my friend, rehearsing in my mind what would happen if my son appeared or if the buyers hesitated. Every detail mattered. The house, the transaction, the unspoken message. It all had to align perfectly. I entered the living room and positioned myself near the entrance. The air was thick with a sense of potential confrontation. I felt a pang of disbelief mixed with resolve, thinking that just days ago, my son had treated the sale as casual, almost as a joke. How could he have so lightly dismissed the years of work, the emotional weight embedded in every corner of this house? The sense of betrayal lingered, but I reminded myself that action, not emotion, was required. As the first potential buyer arrived, I greeted them politely, maintaining a calm, composed demeanor. I noticed the subtle looks they exchanged, their curiosity about the home evident but tempered by professional detachment. My friend guided them quietly toward the paperwork, handling the practicalities while I observed the interaction, silently calculating how to assert my authority without causing unnecessary tension. This dance required careful timing. Too early, and the confrontation might ignite prematurely. Too late, and the opportunity could slip away. I thought about my son, imagining his possible reactions if he appeared. Would he protest? Would he try to argue? Or would he recognize, too late, that his actions had set this chain of events in motion? I felt a strange mix of empathy and frustration. The empathy stemmed from the awareness that he was young, impulsive, and perhaps unaware of the full weight of his actions. The frustration came from the realization that years of trust and respect had been casually dismissed. The challenge was to reclaim control without diminishing the familial bond entirely. The buyers completed their review and began discussing the paperwork. I stayed quiet, observing, letting the process unfold under my careful gaze. I noted their hesitation, subtle questions, and glances toward me and my friend. The tension built, and I recognized that my presence alone conveyed more than words could. Every glance, every gesture, became a signal of authority and intention. I could feel the emotional energy in the room, a blend of curiosity, apprehension, and unspoken acknowledgement that the dynamics were more complex than they had anticipated. As the signing progressed, my son appeared at the doorway, his casual demeanor replaced by visible confusion and a touch of defensiveness. He froze, perhaps expecting resistance or confrontation. Instead, I maintained a calm stance, acknowledging his presence without immediately engaging. The silence hung between us, heavy but purposeful. This moment was pivotal. Any misstep could inflame the situation, yet measured composure could shift the balance firmly in my favor. I felt a subtle surge of satisfaction as I watched him process the scene. The buyers, the documents, the orchestrated sequence that left no room for hasty objections. He looked between me and my friend, realizing that the act of repurchasing the house was proceeding seamlessly. I held his gaze, silently communicating both authority and restraint. There was no need for harsh words. The situation itself conveyed the message with clarity. The emotional undercurrent, the acknowledgement of betrayal, the assertion of control was unmistakable. My mind flickered briefly to past conversations, moments when my son had assumed authority prematurely or dismissed my guidance. Those flashes were not just memories. They were lessons in strategy, teaching me how to navigate the current moment with precision. I drew on those insights now, balancing empathy with firmness, creating an environment where the correct outcome was inevitable but handled with dignity. I felt a quiet pride in the way preparation and reflection had allowed me to turn a potentially volatile situation into a controlled assertion of ownership. The final signatures were completed with minimal disruption. I watched each hand place a mark on the papers, the reality of the transaction settling firmly into the room. My friend glanced at me, a subtle nod affirming that the operation had succeeded. I allowed myself a restrained exhale, feeling the weight of the tension dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. The house, my home, had been reclaimed without unnecessary drama, restoring not just ownership but also a sense of justice and recognition. I turned to my son, who now seemed to understand the implications of his previous action. There was no need for anger, no room for theatrics. The silent lesson was already internalized. The home, the effort, the emotional weight of decisions could not be overlooked or dismissed. In that moment, a fragile but necessary acknowledgement passed between us. Trust might need to be rebuilt and respect reaffirmed, but the immediate crisis had been resolved. Walking through the rooms afterward, I noted the familiar patterns of light and shadow, the quiet hum of the house settling into normalcy. Each space seemed to exhale, as though relieved by the restoration of order and the return of proper care. I felt a mix of relief and reflection, appreciating the subtle victories embedded in what could have been a messy confrontation. The day had demanded patience, planning, and composure, and I had met that demand with a steady hand. The evening drew in, and the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving long shadows and a calm quiet. I lingered in the hallway once more, absorbing the stillness, the faint echo of footsteps, and the subtle warmth that comes from a space being respected and preserved. The house had survived the disruption intact, and I had proven to myself, and quietly to my son, that years of labor and care could not be undermined without consequence. In that calm, I understood that reclaiming the home was also a reclaiming of personal dignity, a statement that the bonds of family required acknowledgement and respect. The house was quiet now, but the echoes of earlier tension lingered in the corners, in the faint creak of the floorboards and the soft whistle of air through the windows. I moved from room to room, touching familiar surfaces with deliberate care, letting the physical act of reclaiming my home reinforce the emotional victory I had achieved. Yet even in this calm, a subtle unease remained. The transaction had concluded, yes, but the undercurrent of betrayal, the knowledge that my son had acted without consultation, was not so easily erased. I had won the house back, but the trust between us had been shaken, and I knew it would require more than paperwork to restore it. Later that afternoon, I found myself seated in the living room with a cup of tea, the steam curling upward in thin wisps that mirrored my swirling thoughts. I thought about the sequence of events, the listing, the showing, the silent choreography with my friend to secure the house. Each step had been planned, each decision deliberate, but I realized that the emotional stakes had been even higher than I had anticipated. My son's impulsive choice had forced me into a position where I had to assert authority not with anger but with strategy, and I felt the strain of both relief and exhaustion pressing against me. I imagined his perspective, trying to see the situation through his eyes. Perhaps he had assumed that listing the house was harmless, a trivial act in the larger sweep of his life. Perhaps he had not fully considered the emotional weight tied to the property, to the years of labor and care it represented. And yet, the disregard for communication was a sharp lesson. I felt the need to balance firmness with understanding, to acknowledge that mistakes happen while maintaining the boundaries that had been crossed. The tension between empathy and authority defined the afternoon, and I wrestled with it quietly. A knock at the door pulled me from my reflections. It was my son, standing awkwardly, hands stuffed into his pockets, eyes searching mine for some signal of forgiveness or approval. He had clearly rehearsed the moment, but rehearsal could not mask uncertainty entirely. I gestured for him to sit, and we both settled into a careful silence. The air between us was thick, charged with words left unspoken. I sensed the internal negotiation in his expression, the conflict between defiance and remorse, between pride and recognition of the breach he had caused. We began to talk, haltingly at first. I asked him to explain his thought process, to lay bare the reasoning behind listing the house without permission. His words were uneven, alternating between justification and tentative acknowledgement of my feelings. I listened carefully, resisting the urge to interrupt or correct, understanding that this was his moment to confront his own actions. The conversation was a delicate dance, each phrase carrying weight, each pause an opportunity for reflection. I felt the subtle shift in tone as he moved from defensiveness toward tentative recognition of the consequences of his choices. Throughout our conversation, I noticed the tension slowly ease, replaced by a cautious attempt at reconciliation. He admitted that he had underestimated the emotional gravity of the house, that he had not anticipated the ripple effect of his decision. I acknowledged his admission, but I also emphasized that certain lines could not be crossed without consequence. The dialogue was neither confrontational nor indulgent. It was deliberate, aimed at rebuilding trust while reinforcing accountability. I felt a sense of progress, though I knew the repair of trust would be gradual, unfolding over months or even years. As the evening settled in, I walked him through the house, room by room. Each space had its own history, each corner its own significance. I shared memories embedded in the walls, small anecdotes that he might have overlooked before. These stories were not merely nostalgic. They were lessons, subtle reminders of the care, attention, and emotional labor invested in the home. I saw him listening, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking questions that reflected a growing appreciation of the depth of what had been taken for granted. I could sense a subtle transformation taking place, not abrupt but undeniable. The son who had acted impulsively was beginning to grasp the broader implications of his actions. The conversation, the walkthrough, the quiet acknowledgement of care and effort, all of it was creating a framework for understanding. I felt a tentative hope, fragile yet persistent, that this moment of conflict could evolve into a deeper connection, a renewed sense of respect and communication between us. Later, as the house grew dim with the fading light, we sat together on the porch. The silence was companionable, not uncomfortable, filled with the soft ambient sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. I realized that reclaiming the house had been only part of the journey. Reclaiming the relationship, reestablishing lines of communication, and demonstrating that respect and responsibility were essential components of family life was equally critical. The physical space had been restored, but the emotional architecture was just beginning to rebuild. The day concluded with an unspoken understanding. My son had learned a lesson that could not be erased by excuses or justification, and I had demonstrated, quietly but firmly, that respect and consultation were non-negotiable, that familial bonds required acknowledgement and care. The home, once again, felt whole, not only because it was under my ownership but because the experience had prompted reflection, dialogue, and an initial step toward reconciliation. I felt a mixture of pride, relief, and cautious optimism, knowing that the real work, the emotional repair, would continue, but that it had begun on solid footing. Even after the initial conversation on the porch, a subtle tension lingered in the air, a quiet reminder that the resolution of the house itself did not automatically resolve the deeper layers of our relationship. I found myself thinking late into the night about what had led to this moment. My son's decision to list the house without my knowledge was impulsive, yes, but it also spoke to unspoken dynamics between us. Unaddressed expectations, assumptions, and misunderstandings that had accumulated over years. I realized that reclaiming the house was only the beginning. The more difficult work lay in addressing the emotional gaps that had allowed such a breach to occur. The next morning, I moved through the house, noticing small details with renewed attention. The hallway walls still bore faint marks from childhood games. The kitchen counters held the ghost of countless family meals, and the living room, though restored to order, seemed to hum with memories of laughter and quiet evenings. These physical reminders grounded me in the reality that the house was more than a property. It was a repository of our shared history. I thought about how easily that history could be disrupted if communication failed, and I resolved to address not only the physical boundaries of ownership but also the emotional boundaries that had been tested. I invited my son to join me for breakfast, hoping to continue the dialogue in a less formal, more casual setting. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on the table and softening the edges of tension that still clung to us. Over coffee and toast, we began to discuss not only the events surrounding the listing but also the broader dynamics of our family. I encouraged him to speak openly about his motivations, his frustrations, and his perspective on how we could prevent similar conflicts in the future. The conversation was tentative but meaningful, each of us navigating carefully between honesty and sensitivity. As he spoke, I noted the subtle changes in his tone. There was a recognition of the seriousness of his actions, a humility that had not been present in earlier encounters. He admitted that he had underestimated not only the value of the house but also the symbolic weight it carried for me. I acknowledged his admission, affirming that while mistakes were inevitable, accountability and communication were non-negotiable. This delicate balance of firmness and empathy became the framework for our discussion, and I felt a sense of cautious hope that we were beginning to rebuild trust, step by careful step. Later, I reflected on how the situation had illuminated patterns in our relationship that had gone unexamined for years. I realized that my son's impulsivity was not merely a personal flaw but a symptom of deeper dynamics. Unspoken expectations, assumptions about autonomy, and a lack of clarity about shared responsibilities. I began to consider ways to structure our interactions differently, to create space for dialogue before decisions that affected both of us were made. The house had become a catalyst, forcing us to confront not only a single act of betrayal but also the underlying currents that had made such a moment possible. In the afternoon, we walked through the neighborhood, observing familiar sights and sharing memories of earlier times. These walks became a bridge, connecting past and present, allowing us to explore not only the events of the previous week, but also the broader context of our family history. We spoke about other moments when misunderstandings had arisen, moments that had left small fractures in trust. By tracing these patterns, we were able to see the threads that led to the recent conflict, acknowledging the ways in which both of us had contributed to the tension while reaffirming the commitment to repair the relationship. One insight became increasingly clear. Reclaiming the house was not the same as reclaiming control or authority. True restoration required dialogue, empathy, and a willingness to engage with discomfort. I noticed that my son began to mirror this understanding, pausing before responding, considering my words with more attentiveness than before. The gestures were small, slight nods, careful phrasing, but they carried weight. In these subtleties, I sensed the initial stages of reconciliation, the first tangible signs that our relationship could recover from the rupture, even if the process would be gradual. By evening, we returned to the house, where I suggested a collaborative activity, organizing a room together, sorting through items that had accumulated over the years. This task, mundane on the surface, became an unexpected conduit for conversation and connection. As we worked, memories surfaced, both shared and individual, and we discussed them freely without judgment. I realized that these small acts of cooperation were building a foundation for trust, demonstrating that respect and collaboration could coexist with independence and growth. At the end of the day, I found myself reflecting on the paradox of ownership and relationship. The house had been the center of conflict, but it was also the medium through which understanding could be rebuilt. The physical space, once a symbol of division, had become a canvas for dialogue, reflection, and slow restoration of trust. I felt a mixture of relief and determination, knowing that the next steps would require continued patience, careful communication, and a willingness to confront discomfort with honesty. I also considered how this episode might shape future decisions, both for myself and my son. The experience highlighted the importance of transparency, consultation, and mutual respect in our interactions. I resolved to establish clearer guidelines, to ensure that the bonds between us were reinforced before similar conflicts could arise again. The lessons were hard-earned, but they were embedded in both memory and practice, a tangible reminder of the work required to maintain family connections amidst challenges and misunderstandings. As night settled in, I felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing the first signs of emotional reconciliation. The house was no longer merely a place to live. It was a symbol of resilience, dialogue, and the potential for growth even after betrayal. I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but the framework for handling them had begun to take shape. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a moment of calm, a recognition that progress, though incremental, was real and that the bond between parent and child, while tested, was capable of repair. Even with a tentative sense of reconciliation settling over us, the echoes of the earlier betrayal lingered like shadows at the edges of the room. I woke early, unable to quiet my thoughts, reflecting on the choices that had led us to this moment. My son had acted impulsively, listing the house without consulting me, and while we had begun to rebuild trust, the questions remained. Why did he feel he could make such a unilateral decision, and how could I ensure that this wouldn't repeat? I realized that reclaiming the house was only the first step. Understanding the motivations and fears driving his actions was equally essential. I decided to spend the morning revisiting the house with fresh eyes, walking through each room slowly, noting the small details that held personal history. The living room carried the faint scent of old books, a reminder of hours spent reading together. The kitchen counters bore minor scratches, each mark a memory of bustling activity during family gatherings. Even the bedroom I had once occupied as a child contained traces of past routines, moments that seemed to whisper lessons I had overlooked. These details reminded me that the house was more than a structure. It was a vessel of memories, expectations, and unspoken agreements. By late morning, my son joined me again, this time bringing a notebook filled with his thoughts and reflections. He admitted that he had acted out of a desire to assert independence but had failed to consider the weight of our shared history. He spoke with a candor that surprised me, acknowledging not only his missteps but also the ways in which he had taken for granted the emotional labor I had invested in maintaining the household. I listened quietly, noting the subtleties in his tone, hesitation, genuine remorse, and a tentative willingness to bridge the gap that had opened between us. As we moved from room to room, we engaged in practical tasks, organizing and sorting items that had accumulated over time. These tasks became more than chores. They were opportunities to observe behavior, gauge sincerity, and practice patience. I noticed that he approached decisions with more thoughtfulness, consulting me rather than assuming, and I began to sense that the previous rupture had opened a space for learning. The interplay between accountability and forgiveness became tangible, unfolding in the gestures, pauses, and shared decisions we made throughout the day. During lunch, I encouraged him to share his broader perspective, how he envisioned the future of the house and our relationship. He spoke cautiously but with intention, outlining ways to involve me in significant decisions and to establish clearer boundaries. I responded with honesty, detailing my own expectations and concerns, ensuring that the dialogue was reciprocal rather than didactic. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of alignment emerging, a mutual understanding that while mistakes had been made, there was potential for growth, collaboration, and restored trust. The afternoon brought a reflective quiet. I wandered into the garden, observing the interplay of sunlight and shadows across the lawn. This space had once been a backdrop for family celebrations and moments of solitude alike. I realized that the tension between us had not diminished the beauty of these spaces but had reframed their significance. They were reminders that relationships, like gardens, required care, attention, and the willingness to address weeds before they overtook the ground. This metaphor crystallized my thoughts. Reconciliation required not only acknowledgement of past errors, but also a proactive approach to nurturing respect and communication. Later, I suggested a walk through the nearby park, a neutral space where conversation could flow more freely. The movement, the fresh air, and the absence of immediate domestic pressures allowed for a different rhythm of dialogue. We spoke about earlier disagreements, childhood memories, and small incidents that had contributed to misaligned expectations. The dialogue was measured, reflective, and at times punctuated by pauses, moments to absorb and internalize each other's perspectives. I began to see that trust was being reconstructed not through grand gestures but through consistent, deliberate attention to communication and understanding. As evening approached, I found myself returning to the living room alone, reflecting on the day's progress. The house, once a source of tension, now carried traces of collaboration and dialogue. I considered how small, intentional acts, listening, acknowledging, planning together, had begun to reshape our relationship. The journey was far from over, but the patterns of engagement established today would serve as a framework for addressing future conflicts. The key insight was clear. Reconciliation was not a single event, but a series of ongoing choices that demanded attentiveness and empathy. Before dinner, my son approached me with a quiet question. How could we prevent misunderstandings like this from happening again? The question itself reflected a shift in attitude, from reactive defensiveness to proactive collaboration. I suggested we implement regular check-ins and create a shared calendar for decisions affecting the house or family matters. He agreed readily, nodding as though he understood the significance of establishing these structures. I felt a mixture of relief and cautious optimism, recognizing that while the past could not be undone, the future could be shaped by conscious, collaborative efforts. As night fell, I walked through the house one more time, pausing at each room to reflect on the memories, both joyful and painful, that had accumulated within these walls. The house had tested our resilience, challenged our assumptions, and demanded a confrontation with unspoken dynamics. Yet it had also revealed the capacity for dialogue, understanding, and emotional growth. I felt a quiet gratitude for this process, acknowledging that while the journey toward full reconciliation was ongoing, meaningful steps had been taken. The events of the day offered a foundation of hope, an acknowledgement that relationships, though fragile, could be strengthened through patience, reflection, and mutual effort. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the familiar walls. Yet the house felt different, somehow lighter, but still carrying the invisible weight of recent conflicts. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, listening to the hum of life outside, and allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. The day before had offered glimpses of understanding and tentative reconciliation, but I could not ignore the lingering questions about trust, boundaries, and the subtle fissures that had emerged between my son and me. How could we move forward without the past influencing every decision? I resolved to explore these questions carefully, knowing that each conversation held the potential to rebuild or unravel the fragile piece. I decided to begin by revisiting the contracts and paperwork that had accompanied the listing of the house. Even though I had repurchased it through a friend, reviewing each document helped me understand the procedural steps my son had taken and the implications of his unilateral decision. The technicalities, dates, signatures, clauses, revealed both naivety and a surprising confidence in his actions. It became clear that while the act itself was impulsive, it was fueled by a deeper desire to claim autonomy and assert control. Recognizing this shifted my perspective slightly. The betrayal felt less like malice and more like a misalignment of intentions, albeit with serious consequences. Later, we convened in the living room to address the underlying issues directly. I initiated the conversation, explaining how the house represented more than bricks and mortar. It held memories, security, and a sense of identity. He listened quietly, nodding, and for the first time I noticed a subtle hesitancy in his posture, a signal that he understood the gravity of his actions. We discussed the importance of communication and how his failure to consult me had jeopardized not only our shared history, but also the potential for future cooperation. Each sentence I spoke felt like a careful bridge, designed to convey both the weight of disappointment and the possibility of rebuilding trust. The dialogue gradually shifted to a more introspective tone. He spoke about his experiences in his own life, how pressure from work, relationships, and personal expectations had influenced his decision-making. I realized that this conversation was more than a discussion about property. It was an opportunity to understand the emotional landscape that had shaped his choices. By hearing his vulnerabilities, I could separate the act from the actor, focusing on pathways for improvement rather than lingering on resentment. This perspective, though not immediate relief, planted the seeds for empathy and constructive engagement. We spent the afternoon establishing practical guidelines for the house's management. Decisions about renovations, maintenance, and potential sales were documented, and each required joint approval. This process was not just about setting rules. It was a symbolic acknowledgement of shared responsibility and mutual respect. As we worked through lists and schedules, I noticed small moments of collaboration. A shared glance, an offer to handle a task, a suggestion carefully weighed before speaking. These gestures, though minor, signaled a shift in the dynamic and hinted at a gradual restoration of trust. Even as progress was made, subtle tensions lingered beneath the surface. I observed him moving through spaces I had once claimed as my own, and a pang of residual hurt reminded me that forgiveness is not linear. Each step forward carried echoes of past misunderstandings, and I had to remind myself that healing requires patience. I made a conscious effort to frame criticisms constructively and acknowledge his contributions openly, reinforcing a pattern of mutual respect rather than dominance. In the evening, we revisited personal belongings that had accumulated over the years, unpacking boxes and sorting items. This task, at first purely logistical, evolved into a reflective exercise. We discovered old photographs, letters, and mementos that sparked conversation and shared nostalgia. I realized that these objects were touchstones, anchors for memory and emotion, and that by engaging with them together, we were restoring not only physical space but also relational space. Each item examined and each story recalled became a thread weaving us closer, bridging the gap that had formed. Later, I suggested a quiet walk around the neighborhood. The act of stepping outside our domestic space provided clarity and perspective. We spoke more freely, discussing hopes, fears, and aspirations. The conversation was not perfect. Pauses, hesitations, and occasional misunderstandings occurred, but the willingness to engage authentically marked a turning point. I noticed that our dialogue was no longer reactive but anticipatory, aimed at preventing conflict rather than solely responding to it. This shift, subtle yet significant, reflected growth and the early stages of mutual understanding. Returning home, I took a moment alone to reflect on the day's developments. The house, once a battleground for autonomy and control, had become a space for dialogue, introspection, and incremental progress. I recognized that trust is fragile, easily fractured by miscommunication and impulsive choices, yet capable of repair through consistent effort and empathetic listening. While the path ahead remained uncertain, the foundations of reconciliation were emerging, marked by deliberate actions and conscious attention to shared responsibilities. As night descended, I prepared for bed with a renewed sense of purpose. I understood that healing is ongoing, shaped by daily choices, transparent communication, and the willingness to confront difficult truths without resentment. The events of the day had reinforced the importance of empathy, patience, and structure, guiding both my son and me toward a future where collaboration and mutual respect could coexist with individual autonomy. The journey was far from complete, but each step, conversation, and shared experience brought us closer to a sustainable reconciliation. The following morning, I awoke to a quiet house, the familiar hum of the city barely filtering through the windows. The prior days had been a mixture of tension and tentative understanding, and now a stillness hung in the air, a pause that felt like an opportunity to assess the progress we had made. As I sipped my coffee, I considered the decisions my son had made in haste, listing the house without consultation. The action itself still stung, yet the conversations, reflections, and joint efforts had begun to reshape our relationship. I realized that the house was no longer a mere property. It was a mirror reflecting our patterns of communication, trust, and respect. I decided to take the day to organize the home further, focusing on spaces that had become points of contention. The study, cluttered with papers, books, and personal belongings, seemed symbolic of the chaos and lack of clarity that had characterized our recent conflicts. Sorting through the piles, I came across letters and notes from my son, messages I had overlooked or dismissed as trivial in the past. Reading them now, I recognized the attempts to connect, even when his methods were misguided. It reminded me that understanding someone often requires patience and a willingness to look beyond the immediate offense. Later, my son joined me in the study. We moved boxes and files together, occasionally pausing to exchange thoughts or share memories associated with the items we uncovered. These interactions, practical yet personal, revealed layers of our relationship that had remained hidden under daily routines and misunderstandings. A stack of old photographs prompted a conversation about family traditions, missed celebrations, and moments we had never fully acknowledged. I noticed that the tone had softened. There was no defensiveness, only cautious curiosity. This was a sign that trust, though fragile, was beginning to reestablish itself. As we worked, we also discussed the future of the house. I expressed my hopes for stability and the preservation of memories while acknowledging his desire for independence and decision-making authority. Our conversation was careful, deliberate, and grounded in honesty. He shared his vision for renovations, modifications, and potential investments, while I contributed historical and practical insights. Through this exchange, I realized that our conflict had not been purely personal. It had also been about differing visions and priorities. Understanding this allowed us to navigate the discussion without escalating into argument. In the afternoon, I suggested taking a walk around the property, inspecting areas that required attention. While we moved through the garden and examined the exterior, we discussed how each part of the house held meaning and responsibility. He remarked on how certain decisions could affect both immediate comfort and long-term value. I found myself appreciating his attention to detail, a trait I had once overlooked or dismissed. This acknowledgement, though subtle, created an unspoken bridge, demonstrating that recognizing each other's strengths is as important as addressing mistakes. By evening, I had begun drafting a set of informal guidelines for managing shared responsibilities. These were not legal documents but rather frameworks to prevent future misunderstandings. Responsibilities, timelines, and expectations were outlined collaboratively, with room for dialogue and adjustment. Each section required compromise and mutual agreement, forcing both of us to reflect on priorities and boundaries. This practical approach was less about control and more about fostering accountability and transparency, an essential step in rebuilding trust. During dinner, the conversation shifted to memories of past holidays, family milestones, and lessons learned from challenges we had faced together. These stories, told with humor, regret, or reflection, reminded us of our shared history and reinforced the bond that had been strained but not broken. I noticed that moments of laughter, acknowledgement, and shared vulnerability were emerging naturally, without pretense. This reminded me that even in times of conflict, connection is always possible when honesty and empathy are present. After dinner, I retreated to my room to write reflections in my journal. Documenting the day's events allowed me to process both emotions and observations. I recognized that the initial betrayal of listing the house without permission had triggered feelings of anger and vulnerability, but the ongoing dialogue, collaboration, and acknowledgement of intentions had begun to heal those wounds. Writing became a method of clarity, separating the impulsive actions of the past from the deliberate steps we were taking toward reconciliation. As night settled, I prepared for bed, aware that the day had offered lessons in patience, understanding, and practical empathy. While the past could not be erased, we were actively shaping the future through thoughtful communication, shared responsibility, and an appreciation for each other's perspectives. The house, once a symbol of unilateral decisions and impulsive actions, was transforming into a space of mutual respect, reflection, and possibility. I understood that reconciliation is a process, and each day brings opportunities to reinforce trust and rebuild connection. Before closing my eyes, I allowed a moment of gratitude, grateful for the conversations, for the glimpses of understanding, and for the small victories that signaled progress. Though challenges remained, the trajectory of our relationship had shifted from tension and mistrust toward dialogue, collaboration, and cautious optimism. This day, like the days to come, would be a step in the ongoing journey of family, understanding, and the quiet work of repairing bonds. The next morning, the house felt different, not in structure or decoration, but in atmosphere. The tension that had hovered like a shadow was lighter, replaced by a quiet, cautious curiosity. I brewed my coffee, noticing how the steam rose and curled in the morning light, and thought about the events that had brought us here. My son had surprised me with his persistence in pursuing the house's sale, and I had surprised myself by orchestrating a way to reclaim it without confrontation. Yet, even as progress seemed to unfold, I sensed there were still unspoken truths and lingering resentment beneath the surface. As I moved through the kitchen, I thought about the delicate balance between asserting authority and fostering collaboration. The prior weeks had taught me that a family's dynamics often pivot on subtle gestures, listening more than speaking, acknowledging intentions, and allowing space for reflection. My son's actions had felt like betrayal at first, but in hindsight, they were more a reflection of his eagerness to claim independence than outright disrespect. Understanding the difference was key to managing my emotions and avoiding escalation. He entered the kitchen just as I finished cleaning the counters. I suggested we sit and review the documents related to the house transaction, not as a confrontation, but as a shared task. We laid the papers on the table, reviewing each one carefully, noting areas that required clarification or adjustment. While the discussion was practical, it carried an undercurrent of trust building. He asked questions, I responded, and together we navigated points that could have led to argument. I realized that approaching these matters with curiosity rather than judgment created a space for dialogue that had been missing before. Afterward, I proposed a walk around the neighborhood to inspect the property and assess potential improvements. The streets were quiet, punctuated by the occasional car passing, yet the calmness contrasted with the internal storm of emotions I had carried for days. As we moved through the garden and examined the exterior, I noted small areas that could benefit from attention. Overgrown hedges, cracked pavement, and fences in need of reinforcement. My son listened intently, occasionally offering suggestions that surprised me with their practicality and thoughtfulness. These exchanges reinforced my realization that collaboration required both parties to contribute their insights without overshadowing the other. Returning inside, I suggested a brainstorming session for future house management. We discussed responsibilities, scheduling, and expectations in detail, ensuring clarity on both sides. I emphasized the importance of communication and revisiting decisions before acting unilaterally. He nodded, acknowledging that the previous listing had been impulsive and that coordination moving forward would prevent misunderstandings. This acknowledgement, though brief, carried weight. It signaled awareness, responsibility, and a willingness to adjust behavior for the sake of harmony. As the day progressed, we delved into shared memories tied to the house. Photographs, letters, and mementos prompted stories and reflections, some light-hearted, others tinged with regret. I recognized that revisiting these moments was more than nostalgia. It was a way to connect emotionally, bridging gaps that had been created by recent tensions. Each memory reinforced the understanding that our bond was multifaceted, layered with history, affection, and sometimes disappointment. Engaging with these recollections allowed both of us to contextualize our disagreements within a broader narrative of family life. Later in the afternoon, I decided to take a break and sit in the study with a notebook, jotting down insights and observations. Writing helped me articulate my feelings and assess the progress made without judgment or distraction. I realized that reclaiming the house was not merely about ownership but about restoring dignity, autonomy, and mutual respect. This awareness reframed the conflict from a confrontation to an opportunity for growth, both personal and relational. Dinner became another chance for reflection. Conversation flowed more naturally than it had in weeks. We discussed daily routines, upcoming commitments, and practical matters regarding house maintenance. Occasionally, laughter punctuated the exchanges, signaling a softening of tension. I noticed that even small acknowledgments, thanking each other for contributions, validating opinions, or simply sharing stories, had a profound effect on rebuilding trust. These gestures were subtle but essential components of repairing the relationship. As night fell, I prepared for bed with a sense of cautious optimism. The day had been productive, not just in practical terms but in emotional reconciliation. I recognized that the journey toward understanding and collaboration is rarely linear. Setbacks and misunderstandings can still arise. However, by focusing on communication, mutual respect, and reflection, the trajectory was shifting positively. I allowed myself a quiet moment of gratitude, acknowledging that progress, no matter how incremental, was meaningful. Before sleep, I reviewed our shared progress and made mental notes of areas requiring continued attention. The house, once a symbol of unilateral decision-making and family tension, had begun to transform into a space reflecting cooperation, understanding, and resilience. I realized that reclaiming the house was only part of the journey. The deeper achievement was cultivating a relationship grounded in empathy, accountability, and shared responsibility. These reflections reinforced the lesson that family conflicts, while painful, often present opportunities for growth and reconciliation when approached thoughtfully. The next morning, sunlight filtered gently through the curtains, casting patterns on the living room floor. I moved quietly, still absorbing the previous day's conversations, trying to reconcile the conflicting emotions swirling inside me. My son had begun showing subtle changes: patience, attentiveness, and a willingness to listen. It was too soon to assume the rift had been fully healed, but there was a softness now where tension had once dominated. I poured myself a cup of tea and lingered near the window, reflecting on how fragile yet resilient relationships could be, and how easily misunderstandings could fester if left unchecked. I decided to address the house's financial aspects next. Sitting at the dining table, I spread out invoices, property taxes, and renovation estimates. My son joined me, leaning over the papers, occasionally pointing out details I might have missed. It struck me how different this interaction was compared to the days when his unilateral decisions had created friction. There was collaboration now, a shared sense of accountability that felt both relieving and strange. I caught myself smiling quietly, thinking that small gestures of cooperation could carry enormous emotional weight in mending familial bonds. We paused briefly when a delivery arrived, and it was a chance to observe his reactions in real time. He was polite, courteous, and even deferred certain decisions to me. I felt a mixture of pride and caution. While it was encouraging to see his maturity, I reminded myself not to let past grievances cloud the present. This balance between awareness and forgiveness had become a personal mantra. It reminded me that reclaiming authority was not about dominance but about fostering understanding while maintaining dignity. Later, I suggested walking through the house room by room, not just to inspect its condition, but to discuss visions for the future. Each room carried memories, echoes of laughter, arguments, and milestones. I encouraged him to share his thoughts honestly, and he did with a mix of hesitation and sincerity. We discussed furniture placement, repainting, and small improvements that could elevate the living experience. Beyond practical considerations, these conversations acted as emotional exercises, allowing us to navigate lingering resentment while cultivating shared purpose. During lunch, we revisited some earlier disagreements in a calm, analytical way. Rather than framing the discussions as confrontations, we approached them as lessons, understanding motivations, acknowledging mistakes, and exploring compromise. I noticed a subtle shift in tone. He asked questions without defensiveness, and I offered clarifications without condescension. This exchange reinforced the idea that healing often requires patience, listening, and strategic honesty. By framing the conversation as problem-solving rather than accusation, we began rebuilding trust incrementally. The afternoon brought an unexpected distraction. A prospective tenant called to ask questions about the house. I suggested my son handle the conversation, observing from a distance. He managed it with surprising tact, answering questions confidently yet thoughtfully. Witnessing his growth in handling responsibility left me reflecting on how much potential is unlocked when guidance replaces control. His demeanor hinted that he was beginning to appreciate not just the material value of the house, but also the weight of stewardship and decision-making that accompanied it. By evening, we decided to catalog items within the house that had sentimental or practical importance. This exercise was more than inventory. It became a conduit for storytelling. Each object carried memories, photos, letters, heirlooms, and sharing their significance opened doors to empathy. He listened when I recounted moments from the past and shared his own recollections. I realized that transparency, storytelling, and shared reflection were proving more powerful in bridging the gap than any lecture or admonition could have been. Dinner carried a similar tone of quiet collaboration. We discussed upcoming maintenance, gardening plans, and even holiday preparations. Laughter occasionally punctuated these conversations, signaling that connection was strengthening. I noticed the subtle cues of respect emerging. He paused to let me speak, acknowledged my suggestions, and even initiated ideas himself. These interactions underscored the importance of allowing room for growth and recognizing that emotional repair is often gradual rather than instantaneous. Before bed, I walked through the house alone, noting details that had previously gone unnoticed. A creak in the floorboard, a fading spot on the wall, the way light hit a certain corner of the garden. Observing these details in solitude, I reflected on how reclaiming the house was intertwined with reclaiming agency over my own emotions and choices. The house, once a battlefield, was now a space for reflection, connection, and subtle transformation. I realized that the journey was far from over, yet every step forward reinforced the potential for enduring reconciliation and understanding. As I settled into bed, I allowed myself a quiet moment of gratitude, mindful of the lessons learned about patience, empathy, and the delicate art of rebuilding family ties. Tomorrow would bring further challenges and conversations, but the foundation laid over these past days gave me confidence that progress, however incremental, was genuine and sustainable. The house was no longer just a physical space. It was a living symbol of resilience, dialogue, and the possibility of renewed trust. The morning air was crisp as I stepped into the garden, the scent of earth and blooming flowers carrying a quiet familiarity. I paused at the gate, thinking about the events that had led to this point, the listings, the betrayal, and ultimately, the reclaiming of my home through careful maneuvering. Even now, a part of me was wary. I had been hurt before, And while the house was under my control once more, the emotional scars of my son's unilateral actions remained. As I walked along the path, I reminded myself that rebuilding trust is rarely straightforward. It requires patience, consistency, and courage to remain open to change. I heard footsteps behind me, and my son joined me, offering a tentative smile. The silence between us felt less strained than before. Without speaking immediately, we began tending to the flower beds, pulling weeds, trimming hedges, and planting fresh blooms. The physical labor created a rhythm, a shared activity that demanded collaboration without the pressure of dialogue. In these moments, I could observe subtle changes: how he listened, how he waited for guidance before taking action, and how he seemed to internalize lessons learned from prior conflicts. There was a humility in his movements that had been absent during the height of the disagreement, a willingness to be present rather than assert dominance. As we moved toward the back of the garden, I shared a story from my own youth, recalling how I had once mismanaged responsibilities and learned the consequences of acting impulsively. He listened attentively, nodding occasionally, and asked questions that reflected genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. I realized then that storytelling could bridge generations, offering lessons without lectures, fostering empathy, and allowing one to see past mistakes as opportunities for growth. The garden became a living metaphor for our reconciliation, roots representing past grievances, and fresh seedlings symbolizing hope and renewed cooperation. Later, I invited him inside to review the house's maintenance logs and financial documents. Sitting side by side at the table, we discussed the budget, necessary repairs, and upcoming projects. I noticed that our dialogue was calmer, more measured. There was no rush, no underlying tension, only an honest exchange of information and ideas. I could see him weighing my advice thoughtfully, and I made a conscious effort to acknowledge his insights, reinforcing a sense of partnership. This subtle shift from control to collaboration felt pivotal. I understood that true authority in a parent-child relationship often comes from guidance rather than unilateral decisions. The afternoon brought a minor crisis, a small leak in the kitchen sink. Instead of reacting with frustration, I allowed my son to take the lead in resolving the problem. He consulted manuals, called a plumber for guidance, and implemented temporary fixes while I observed. His confidence in handling the situation increased with each step, and I felt a quiet satisfaction at seeing him apply lessons in responsibility. It became evident that the challenges we faced together were as much about emotional development as they were about property management. By evening, we reviewed the guest list for a small family gathering I intended to host in the house. This required planning, compromise, and decision-making together: who would sit where, what dishes to serve, and how to accommodate relatives with particular preferences. I watched him negotiate calmly, consider alternatives, and even suggest creative solutions. Each small victory in collaboration reminded me that the process of regaining trust was cumulative. It built steadily with patience, observation, and intentional guidance. Before dinner, I asked him to accompany me on a tour of the attic, a place where countless forgotten items and heirlooms were stored. We discovered letters, photographs, and memorabilia from previous generations, and each artifact became a conversation starter. He listened as I recounted family stories, sometimes laughing, sometimes reflecting silently. The attic became a symbolic bridge to the past, reminding both of us of shared history and the responsibility to preserve it. These moments of reflection strengthened the bond between us, turning residual resentment into understanding. Later, we cooked a simple meal together, coordinating tasks with surprising efficiency. The act of preparing food, sharing responsibilities, and tasting our creations created an unspoken rhythm. Small gestures, offering spices, adjusting a pan, or tasting sauces, carried emotional significance, reinforcing trust, cooperation, and mutual respect. By nightfall, the house felt warmer, filled not just with light, but with a sense of restored harmony. I sensed that while not all wounds had healed completely, the trajectory was promising. As I prepared for bed, I paused near the window, looking out at the garden illuminated by moonlight. I reflected on the day's events, realizing that reconciliation required intention, not just circumstance. It demanded emotional risk, an openness to hope despite prior betrayals, and a willingness to allow the other person space to demonstrate growth. My son had taken small but meaningful steps toward understanding, and I recognized the significance of these efforts. Though the journey was ongoing, I felt a renewed sense of optimism that the house, our family, and our relationships could thrive if nurtured with patience, respect, and empathy. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting the walls in a warm, golden hue. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the quiet of the house settle over me. Even though the listing and the tension with my son felt like a distant memory now, I knew the emotional work was far from over. Trust, once fractured, doesn't mend overnight. It demands daily attention, small gestures that show reliability, respect, and understanding. As I watched my son moving about the kitchen, preparing breakfast without prompting, I realized that these small acts of responsibility carried enormous significance. They were the tangible proof of his willingness to change. I invited him to join me in reviewing the renovation plans for the living room. Sitting side by side with blueprints spread across the table, we discussed furniture placement, lighting options, and color schemes. His input surprised me. He suggested ideas I hadn't considered, some practical, others creative, demonstrating that his mind was fully engaged in rebuilding not only the house but the relationship. I made a conscious effort to acknowledge his contributions, reinforcing the sense of mutual respect that had been absent during the conflict over the sale. Later, a phone call arrived from a potential buyer who had seen the house before the sale was reversed. I listened politely as he expressed interest and then explained, calmly, that the property was no longer available. My son observed the conversation quietly, and afterward, he asked thoughtful questions about negotiations, contracts, and property rights. I realized that this interest in learning reflected a deeper shift. He wasn't acting impulsively or out of entitlement anymore, but was seeking knowledge to understand the consequences of his actions. We spent the afternoon sorting through old photographs in the attic. Each picture sparked a memory, a story, or a debate. Some images reminded us of joyful family gatherings, while others recalled minor disputes or misunderstandings. My son listened attentively as I narrated anecdotes, and occasionally he offered his perspective. I noticed subtle changes in his tone, less defensive, more reflective, willing to see situations from a broader point of view. I recognized that reconciliation isn't only about forgiveness. It's about cultivating understanding and empathy, a two-way street where both parties contribute to healing. By evening, I proposed a small test of responsibility. He would handle dinner planning for the night while I observed. He approached the task systematically, making a list of ingredients, checking the pantry, and coordinating tasks efficiently. Watching him move with purpose and calm, I felt a mix of relief and pride. These exercises were not about control but about demonstrating capability, building confidence, and nurturing accountability. It became increasingly clear that our relationship's renewal depended on shared responsibility and mutual recognition. As the night deepened, we sat in the living room, reflecting on the week's events. I encouraged him to share his feelings about the earlier conflict, and he spoke candidly about regret, frustration, and the desire to do better. I listened without interruption, offering guidance where necessary, but allowing space for honesty. These conversations, though sometimes uncomfortable, created a foundation for genuine dialogue, one where mistakes could be acknowledged without fear of judgment. Before turning in for the night, I walked through the hallways, noticing the small changes we had implemented together. Fresh flowers on the windowsills, clean surfaces, and rearranged furniture. All reminders of teamwork and renewed commitment. I paused at my son's room, peeking in to see him quietly journaling. He had taken to documenting reflections, thoughts, and plans, a practice I had always valued but he had never embraced before. This simple act symbolized growth, responsibility, and a willingness to engage with his own development. I paused at the doorway, reflecting on the trajectory of our reconciliation. While we were far from perfect, The day's interactions reaffirmed my belief that progress is built on consistent effort, openness, and shared experiences. Trust, respect, and understanding require attention, dialogue, and humility. I felt a cautious optimism, knowing that while the past could not be erased, the future was being actively shaped by deliberate choices, small gestures, and the willingness to grow together. The morning sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the floor where we had spent so many hours restoring both the house and our relationship. Today felt different. There was a sense of completion, not finality, but a quiet acknowledgement that the turbulence of the past had settled, leaving a calmer, more thoughtful atmosphere. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring the aroma, and felt an unusual serenity. It wasn't just the house that had been reclaimed. It was trust, dialogue, and respect that had been painstakingly rebuilt. My son joined me at the kitchen table, holding a notebook filled with plans and reflections. He hesitated, then spoke candidly about the week's events, the lessons he had learned, and the mistakes he wished he could undo. I listened closely, noting the sincerity in his voice and the steadiness in his posture. This was not the impulsive, entitled young man who had listed the house without asking. It was someone transformed by accountability and reflection. For the first time, I felt a genuine alignment between our intentions, a shared understanding of boundaries, and an appreciation of each other's perspectives. We spent the morning finalizing small renovations that had been postponed during the conflict. Choosing paint swatches, arranging furniture, and selecting new decor became acts of collaboration rather than mere chores. Each decision carried symbolic weight, a reminder that mutual effort and compromise could create beauty in both home and relationship. My son suggested placing a framed family photograph in the living room, a gesture I accepted readily, recognizing it as a token of acknowledgement, memory, and unity. Later, I sat down with the legal documents related to the previous attempted sale, reviewing them one final time. I explained to my son the implications not as a lecture, but as guidance. He listened, asking insightful questions that demonstrated a growing comprehension of responsibility and consequences. I realized that knowledge, once absent, had become a tool for empowerment rather than control, bridging gaps that had previously fueled conflict. The afternoon brought a quiet pause, a moment of reflection. We walked through the garden, noting the seasonal changes, tending to plants, and sharing stories from our past. These moments, seemingly mundane, carried profound significance. They symbolized continuity, rootedness, and a willingness to nurture what we both valued. I noticed his attentiveness, the careful way he handled plants and tools, and felt a sense of pride mixed with relief. Transformation, I recognized, is a gradual process, cultivated through repeated acts of care and conscientious behavior. Evening arrived, and we prepared dinner together. The kitchen hummed with activity, laughter, and collaboration. There was no tension, no residual frustration, only a shared focus on creating something tangible and satisfying. Sitting down to eat, I observed how far we had come, from confrontation and betrayal to understanding and cooperation. Conversation flowed naturally, interspersed with humor and reflections on lessons learned. The meal became a celebration, a recognition of growth, and a quiet acknowledgement of the work that had gone into restoring both home and family ties. As night fell, I sat by the window, reflecting on the arc of this journey. The listing of the house had been a shock, a moment of emotional upheaval that revealed vulnerabilities and fractured trust. Yet, in the months that followed, those same vulnerabilities became points of connection, growth, and shared understanding. The house, once a battleground of ego and conflict, had transformed into a living testament to resilience, dialogue, and reconciliation. Before retiring for the night, I walked through each room, observing subtle changes that represented our collective effort: organized spaces, repaired furniture, thoughtful decor, and shared memories captured in photographs. I paused at the doorway to my son's room, noting the light from his desk lamp, the open notebook filled with reflections, and the calm concentration on his face. It was a symbolic moment, highlighting the culmination of lessons learned, maturity gained, and trust earned. Finally, I returned to the living room, where the house felt alive with memories, growth, and renewed harmony. I understood that reconciliation is not a single event but a continuous process, nurtured through patience, communication, and shared experiences. While the past could not be erased, it could inform wiser decisions, encourage empathy, and inspire accountability. The house was more than a structure. It was a symbol of our journey, a repository of mistakes, lessons, and triumphs, now transformed into a home that reflected growth and mutual respect. As I turned off the lights and prepared to rest, I felt a profound sense of closure and hope. We had navigated betrayal, confusion, and resentment, emerging with renewed clarity and strengthened bonds. The house, the relationship, and the lessons embedded within both were intact, resilient, and evolving. I knew challenges would arise again, but this time, we were equipped to meet them together, with understanding, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to preserving both home and family ties. I never imagined I would have to fight so hard for a place I once called home, not against strangers, but against the people I raised. The weight of betrayal lingers in quiet corners of the house, in the memories of every room that once held laughter and warmth. Yet, through the frustration and disbelief, I found a quiet strength within myself, a reminder that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. Owning my choices, standing firm when others try to rewrite my story, has been both exhausting and empowering. Life has a way of testing the limits of our patience, trust, and love, but it also reminds us that resilience isn't just surviving. It's taking back what's rightfully yours, even when the world seems to turn against you. And as one chapter closes, another begins in the shadows of family conflicts that push us to our limits. If you want to see how one person reclaimed control in a moment where time itself seemed to slip away, there's a story waiting that will make you question loyalty, timing, and the true cost of betrayal. Don't miss how one midnight decision can change everything.